Alrighty. Hello, my name is Breezy. This is Down the Rabbit Hole. And today we are going to be discussing Greenwich Village and the House of Death. So, why am these two things in the same thing? Well, if you're curious mind, just like I am, um, the House of Death is located in Greenwich Village. And so while on that topic, why is it Greenwich and not Greenwich? Greenwich? Why is it? I just know it's Greenwich. That's all I know. But there are very few things I know about Greenwich Village. One is that it is a borough in New York. Well, not really a borough. It is in New York City. I also know this is where it was the where Gourmet's World was based at, and I also know this is where the case of where King Genevieve lived until her murder. For that case, you can go to my True Crime Lounge podcast. But today I thought I'd dive into this episode a little bit as we talk about Greenwich Village. So why not, right? This is my podcast. I could do whatever the hell I want to do, right? Anyway, I also think it's important to understand the history of this NYC neighborhood as well. So, let's talk about this little village um, on the west side of Lower Manhattan, shall we? Um, Now, the name comes from Greek. I'm going to do my best to pronounce it, but I promise you, I'm terrible with names, and I'm probably going to butcher this up. Groenrich, which is Dutch for Green District. And in the 20th century, Greenwich Village was known as the artist haven, the bohemian capital, and the cradle of the modern LGBTQ movement, and the East Coast birthplace of the Beat generation and the counterculture of the 1960s. Now, Greenwich Village contains Washington Square Park as well as two New York City private colleges, NYU, which used to be my dream school, but I can barely do snow here in the South. And college up there is just way too expensive. And the new school. In the later years, it became associated with hipsters. Now, Greenwich Village is part of the Manhattan Community District 2 and is patrolled by the 6th Precinct in New York City in the NYC Police Department. Now, Greenwich Village has undergone extensive gentrification and commercialization. Now, the four zip codes that constitute the village 10111, 10112, 10103, 10114 were all ranked among the 10 most expensive in the United States by median housing prices. And according to Forbes, with residential property sales in the West Village neighborhood, typically exceeding about 2,100 square feet in 2017. Now let's talk about the history, shall we? And I will link when I actually do start talking about House of Death. I promise you, I will put it in my notes as a time stop to where I need to put that in the bio. But anyway, in the 16th century, Lenape referred to the furthest northwest corner of the cove of the Hudson River at the present-day Gainsborough Street as a Sapokian, and the land was cleared and turned into a pasture by the Dutch and enslaved Africans, who named their settlement Northrick, which is also spelled Northrick or North District, which is equivalent to Northwich or Northrick. Now, in the 1630s, Governor Ruther Van Twiller farmed tobacco on 200 acres here in his farm in the woods. Now, the English conquered the Dutch settlements in the New Netherland in 1664, and the Greenwich Village developed as a hamlet separate from larger NYC. To the south on the land would eventually become the financial district. In 1634, the 11 Dutch African settlers in the area were granted half freedoms after the first black legal protest in America. All received parcels of land, which is now Greenwich Village, and in an area that became known as the land of the blacks. Now, the earliest known reference to the village's name as Greenwich, yeah, man, thank you, dates back to 1696 and the will of Yellis Mandeville of Greenwich. However, the village was not mentioned in city records until 1713. Now, Sir Peter Warren began accumulating land in 1731 and built a frame house spacious enough to hold sightings in New York General Assembly line. When the smallpox went to the city, dangerous in 1739 and subsequent years, and one occasion in 1746, the house of Mordecai Gomez was used, and Gomez. Now, Warren's house, which survived until the Civil War era, overlooked the North River from the bluff, and it is on a block bounded by Perry and Charles Streets. Bleecker and West 4th Streets can still be recognized by the mid 19th century row houses included in the neighborhood, and still contains many houses on from of the 1830s to 1837 boom. Now, let's talk about Newgate Prison. From 1797 to 1829, the bucolic village of Greenwich was located in New York State's was the location of the New York State's first state penitentiary. Now, Newgate Prison was on the Hudson River, which is Newgate Prison. I cannot talk for some reason. Was on the Hudson River at what is now West 10th Street, near Christopher Street Pier, and the building was designed by Joseph Francis Mangan, who will later design NYC Hall. And although the attention of the Forest Walden Quaker prison reformer Thomas Eddy was to provide a rational humanitarian place to retribution and rehabilitation, the prison soon became overcrowded and a pestilent place, subject to frequent riots, and prisoners would damage the building and kill some inmates. By 1821, the prison designed for 432 inmates held 817. A number made possible only by frequent release of prisoners, sometimes as many as 50 a day. Now, since the prison was north of New York City boundary at the time, being sentenced to Newgate became known as the Sent Up the River, and this term became popularized once prisoners started being sentenced to Sing Sing prison in the town of Ossining, upstream New York City. Now, let's talk about the Isaac Hendricks House, and this is the oldest remaining house in Greenwich Village, and it is the Isaac Hendricks House at 77 Bradford Street. Now, when the church of St. Luke in the Fields was founded in 1820, it stood south of the road down the landing of the North River. In 1822, the yellow fever epidemic in New York encouraged residents to flee for the healthier air of Greenwich Village, and afterwards many stayed. Now, the furthest side of the Washington Square was a potter field from 1797 to 1823. When up to 20,000 of New York's poor were buried here and still remain. Now, the handsome Greek Revival townhouses on the north side of Washington Square were built in 1832, establishing the fashion of Washington Square and the lower Fifth Avenue for decades to come. In the 19th century, the districts of Washington Square were considered to be separate from the Greenwich Village. And in 1825, a commercial advertiser was writing that Greenwich is no longer a country village, such as the growth of the city was one block or more in the Greenwich of New York. By 1850, the city had developed entirely around Greenwich Village, such that the two were no longer considered separate. Now, how did it get its reputation as urban bohemia? Well, Greenwich Village was historically was known as an important landmark of the map of American Bohemian culture. In the early and mid 20th century, the neighborhood was known for its colorful, artistic residents and alternate culture that propagated due to many parts of progressive attitudes of many of the residents. Now, the village was a focal point of the new movement, and ideas now, whether political, artistic, or cultural. The tradition is an enclave of avant-garde and alternative culture was established during the 19th century. It continued into the 20th century when the small presses, art galleries, and experimental theater died. In 1969, Enraged members of the gay community in search for equality started the Stonewall riots. Now, the Stonewall Inn was later recognized as a National Historic Landmark for having been the same location where the gay rights movements originated. And on June 27, 2019, the National LGBTQ Wall of Honor was inaugurated into the Stonewall Inn. And on June 28, 2024, the Stonewall National Monument Center opened, and the first official National Visitor Center is dedicated to the LGBTQ plus experience to open anywhere in the world. Now, numerous politicians and celebrities participated in inauguration ceremonies. In the NYC subways, Christopher Street, Sheridan Street, was also renamed Christopher Street, Stonewall Station on the same day. Now, the 10th Street building was situated at 51 West 10th Street. Now, from the late 19th century until the present, the Hotel Albert served as a cultural icon for Greenwich Village, opening it during the 1880s during the located on 11th Street in University Place, called the Hotel St. Stephen, and in 1902 called the Hotel Albert and Ryder. Now, the Cherry Lane Theater is also located in Greenwich Village. And in 1924, the Cherry Lane Theater was established, and it was located on 38 Commerce Street. It is New York City's oldest continuously running off-Broadway theater as well. On January 8, 1947, stevedore stevedore Andy Hens was fatally shot by hitman John M. Donne, Andrew Sheridan, Danny Gentile in front of his apartment. Before he died, on January 29th, his wife said that Johnny Dunn shot me. Now, the village hosted the first racially integrated nightclub when Cafe Society was opened in 1938, by Bernie Josephson. Now, Cafe Society showcased African American talent that was intended to be an American version of political cabinets that Josephson had seen in Europe during World War I as well. Now, some notable performers here might include Pearl Bailey, Count Basie, Nat King Cole, John Coltrane, Miles Davis, Ella Fitzgerald, Coleman Hawkins, Billie Holiday, Lena Horne, and more. So, what about post-war? Well, a two-story building. During the post-war, um, Greenwich Village became an important to the bohemian scene during the 1950s and everything. But yes, let's talk briefly about the preservation. Since the end of the 20th century, many artists and local historians have mourned the fact that the bohemian days of Greenwich Village are long gone because of the extraordinary high cost of living in the neighborhood. Now, briefly, I do want to talk about Manhattan's third Little Italy. Um, but throughout the 1930s, many Italian Americans started living in Little Italy and moved on the north side of Houston Street. Um, Many of them were immigrants from Naples and Sicily, and during up until the late 2000s, the village became home to the largest speaking Italian speaking communities in the United States. And then in the 2010s, many affluent from northern Italy, especially from Milan, started moving to Greenwich Village, helped strengthening and modernizing the neighborhood, and it's modern day Little Italy. But yeah. Now, with that being said, we are at 1416, which means I will be marking this time on my notes as we talk about the House of Death. Now, in the bustling and picturesque neighborhood of Greenwich Village, there are many streets lined up 100+ brownstones that give up the classic NYC vibe, and a lot of old world Manhattan charm still exists on these city blocks. If I go to New York, this would be one of the areas I would love to visit, honestly. My friend Taylor just was just in New York. I need to ask her how it was when I see her again. Um, but is the House of Death still haunted? Well, what is the House of Death? Well, There is a four-story brownstone building that was constructed sometime during the late 1850s, just before the Civil War had started in Lower Manhattan area, was indeed home to many aspiring NYC socialites, as well as some philanthropic businessmen. And in fact, Johnston was largely responsible for the Metropolitan Underground Railroad and was said to be one of the first tenants of the building. One of the most startling claims from local historians, paranormal enthusiasts that since have been there. Now, there is a ghost of Mark Twain. You might have heard of Mark Twain. Ooh, I should talk about him on my Dark Academia podcast. Anyway, one of 22 spirits is said to be of that the infamous author Samuel Langhorne Clemens, whose pen name you might recognize. That's right. Now, Clemens was said to be arrested there briefly between the year 1901 and 1900 and 1901, and is there even aged a plaque commemorating his stay there. But the building is not where Clemens actually died. He moved on from NYC and died in 1910 in Reading, Connecticut. Although Clemens died in another state nearby, some of his spirits are still haunting the building. Now, the first sighting of it occurred in the 1930s when a resident saw that much of a recognizable spirit of Samuel Clemens outside the window. And as the spirit was approached, it turned the resident to meekly said, "My name is Clemens, and I have problem here I gotta settle," before disappearing. When Clemens' ghost has been seen many times, historians absolutely had no leads as to the problem that was in the spirit referring to what has been settled. The only lead that they may have that maybe Clemens was in debt financially. Other times it has been appeared that the classic Southern gentleman, all white suit, drifting from the bottom of the staircase, displaying a sad expression on his face. There's also where Jan Bartel has investigated the House of Death. Now, Clemens wasn't the only writer whose spirit is said to be lingering in Building 14. Author and actress Jan Bartel once lived in the house during a long building as well. And she said that she and her family had taken up residence in the floor in 1957 as well. And at first, all was going well with Bartel, but late one afternoon, she was personally witness a very large, formidable black shadow manifest in plain in the view and drift across the room. Now, stunned and greatly shaken by the sighting, Bartel and her family employed a high psychic and medium to come. Now, the psychic claimed to have felt the spirits of many people who died and were buried under the building. Also, the spirit of a dead child who was said to be actively among with the spirits of an aborted baby. Now, the aborted baby was said to have belonged to a widow who lived in the building, whose husband died in the Civil War. Devastated by her loss, she chose to abort the child out of both melancholy and delirium. And Bartel later moved out and chronicled some of her experience in the book she wrote. Among other instances, she encountered was a spicy touch of a pair of unseen hands in the back of her neck and her hair, and objects moving in a low growling noise that could be heard. Spendthrift. A spray from a psychic view was the first-hand account Bartrell wrote on her own experience, which was later called the House of Death. Now, let's talk about murder at the House of Death. The building was made national headlines briefly in 1987 when prominent New York NYC attorney John Steinberg, I wonder if he's Jewish, anyway, moved in with his girlfriend, had a nussbun, and their two small children, Lisa and infant Mitchell Steinberg. Now, high on cocaine and savagely beat Hedda and Lisa to a point where the younger girl was legally declared brain dead by the beating. Steinberg was convicted and served a lengthy prison sentence for the crime against the young girls to young girl's death. To this day, on that floor, which stays occasionally, is known to have flicker of lights in very odd times and a possible cry. Now, today, the building is rented out to various tenants on various floors and keeps a rather normal profile. In such a populous city as New York, the long grim history of the building is possibly um, one of many that exist there. But on the sidewalks in the city that never sleeps, it holds true that neither do the spirits. That is it for this episode. Join me next time as we talk about the Sally House in Kansas. All right, y'all have a great day. I'll see you next time.